unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, died nearly 6 decades ago, but it's remarkable how much his legacy continues to color modern Indian life. From the border dispute with China to debates over fundamental rights and Hindu-Muslim relations, the current policy discourse cannot be disentangled from Nehru's own ideological convictions, as well as those who did battle against him. A new book by Tripurdaman Singh and Adeel Hussain, Nehru, The Debates That Defined India, shines a spotlight on 4 consequential debates that Nehru engaged in that get to the heart of the Indian polity. The book presents a raft of primary correspondence from Nehru and his sparring partners, annotated by the author's historical contextualizing and political analysis. I am pleased to welcome both Adeel and Tripurdaman to the show for the very first time. Gentlemen, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having us, Milan.
Thanks. An absolute pleasure.
So, before we get into the details of the book, I'd like to ask you both sort of how this particular partnership between the two of you formed. Adeel, maybe I'll start with you. How did you decide to sort of team up for this project? Was this something that you had been sort of bouncing back and forth? Had you been working together before? Tell us a little bit about the kind of behind the scenes.
Well, the idea behind the book was really born in countless hours sitting outside of the library in our in graduate school in Cambridge. So both of us met there. We were both writing our PhDs in history, and we were both working on India. Very different parts of India, though. So I was looking at constitutional thought, Muslim politics in early 20th century India, and Tripurdaman was looking at the 19th century, but also the long 19th century, so the transition of sovereignty. And what we noticed very early on is that unlike in the West, what was very peculiar about India is that most of the thinking that was done was primarily done by politicians that also implemented it almost immediately during the nationalist struggle, but also later. So ideas were much more influential directly than they were in the West, where there was always a thinker, say somebody like Savigny, and then somebody who implemented those ideas. And here in India, we had politicians that were also doing much of the thinking. So we debated a lot about where these thinkers positioned themselves, and amongst the greatest are, of course, the fathers of the respective nations, both Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Jawaharlal Nehru, Muhammad Iqbal, and others. So the book is really a crystallization of these discussions that led us through graduate school.
Yeah, many of us have had those graduate school chats, outside the coffee shop. They haven't turned into to such erudite books. So I congratulate both of you for that accomplishment. Tripurdaman, your first book, 16 Stormy Days, recounts the contentious debate over the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution. Most of our listeners will know the First Amendment places severe limits on the right to free speech, and you document that beautifully in your book. Many people view this as a significant blemish on Nehru's record, one whose effects are still felt, today in 2022. I'm curious why you decided to delve deeper into the intellectual and policy debates with which Nehru was engaged. Was there something that you felt that you couldn't quite get to in that first book?
Yeah. I think, well, first and foremost is it's impossible to escape the centrality of Nehru, as you've mentioned right at the outset. And my first book is technically my second book, but,
Apologies.
But, it sort of reinforces the centrality of Nehru and the long after effects that those decisions have had. And in countless conversations with Adeel, we realized that there's whenever you kind of dig into any of these questions, there's really no escaping Nehru at all. So things, even though they're not obvious at first glance, always, they're interconnected in many ways. And that kind of really led both of us to join forces and dig deeper into the other aspects that Nehru represented.
Is there a analogous figure in history, if we kind of look out at the contemporary moment, who cast such a long shadow on kind of post-independence, post-colonial policy and practice? I mean, he seems like such a singular figure that he still shows up today in the op-ed pages on almost a daily basis. And it's hard for me to think of somebody else who quite fits that category.
No one does. And he is relevant to to modern India in ways that the same generation of anti-colonial leaders and sort of founding figures haven't. It's just impossible to disentangle current day discourse from Nehru and Nehru's legacy. And I don't think anyone's left as deep an imprint anywhere else as Nehru has left in India. Perhaps Mao, but I don't know.
The book itself presents 4 key debates that Nehru engaged in. There's the first with Muhammad Iqbal over the meaning of nationalism and Muslim identity. There's a debate with Muhammad Ali Jinnah over Hindu-Muslim relations, with Vallabhbhai Patel over China and its relationship with India, and with Shyama Prasad Mukherjee over the First Amendment. You include a lot of primary documentation, mainly correspondence, although not exclusively, between Nehru and these 4 gentlemen, and of course is buttressed by your own thinking and analysis. Adeel, I guess I might ask, how did you decide on these 4 debates, right? I mean, obviously, Nehru was so consequential. He had his hands in so many different jars, as it were. Why these 4 issues?
I mean, the first 2 issues, particularly regarding the Muslim question, the greater Muslim question in India, really came about because when Nehru is rubbing against Iqbal and rubbing against Jinnah, he's defining his own vision of what Hindu-Muslim unity could look like. And he's developing alongside the articulations that he's receiving from the 2 key leaders of Muslim politics. So it was an easy pick. So deciding on Muhammad Iqbal was very straightforward. But what's more intriguing is what they were discussing. So whether they were discussing nationalism, as you rightly point out, but both Muhammad Iqbal and Nehru went into a sphere that they're both not very proficient in. They started discussing theology and theological questions. And for Muhammad Iqbal, who's spent much of his life as a lawyer and as a poet, to go out and define specific contours that would allow individuals to be counted as Muslims is an extraordinary step that he takes. And the responses that he then gets from Nehru, or maybe just to sort of provide a broader context to this thing, is that we're now in the early 20th century. So we're in the 1930s. So the First World War has happened. The idea of European civilizational superiority has died in the battlefield of Verdun. Right? So it's no longer possible for the British to make the straightforward argument that because there's a European civilizational superiority, that translates into a source for political authority to rule over other countries. Now, whereas this argument was very prominent and may have swayed some people in the latter part of the 19th century and in the earliest 20th century, where they had a specific advance in technology, in administration, in bureaucracy, by the time the First World War ends, it very much collapses. And Indians, particularly Indian intellectuals, start thinking about what a political entity could look like and what rights could look like once the colonial state has disappeared. That the colonial state will no longer be around in order to guide Indians in the future is more or less accepted. And this is where different communities start making strong cases of how they foresee the future. And Muhammad Iqbal is one of the Muslim leaders that articulates that vision. And Nehru, of course, as the president of the Congress Party, is articulating a very strong vision of a unitary India, where all communities can live under a greater umbrella of a state that is centrally ruled and very strong. And now these 2 men that should be talking about constitutional reforms are talking about membership in Muslim communities on a theological basis. And they're talking about this because Iqbal makes a suggestion that rubs Nehru off the wrong way, because Iqbal suggests that the colonial state should provide constitutional exclusion of what Iqbal considers an unorthodox movement, a movement that has strayed too far from the principles of Islam. And Nehru,
And this is the
that's the Ahmadiyya
movement.
community. And Nehru comes in defense of the Ahmadiyya community by saying that, well, we fought so hard in the 19th century as Indians to have a sphere where the colonial state does not intervene. And that sphere has been religion. And now you, Iqbal, are inviting the colonial state back in order to legislate within a big sphere that both liberals and more conservatives have cherished over the longest time and seen as a space where they could articulate their ideas freely. And for Nehru, the big danger that comes with legislating religion is, of course, that it would stop any change from happening, any good social change towards progress from happening. And he makes that case towards Iqbal, who then tries to retort. And that's essentially the basic framing of the debate that we capture in the first chapter.
In listening to you unpack this, I'm sort of struck by how intellectually refined some of these arguments were. It's hard to imagine politicians today having this kind of deep, thoughtful, intellectual exchange on what are the kind of controversial policy questions of the day. There is this debate that goes on sometimes. I'm sure you're aware, you may well have commented on it, about, how there was this idea of a golden era in Indian politics in which leaders, despite opposing each other tooth and nail, engaged in this kind of debate. Maybe, in this case, through letters, obviously. Tripurdaman, as a historian who kind of thinks about the longue durée, have we lost the capacity for this kind of discourse? I think most people who listen to the show would find it hard to imagine that, say, Narendra Modi and Rahul Gandhi would be able to have this kind of an elevated discussion.
I think partly that's only to be expected, because 100 years ago, there was no social media, and the penetration of mass media in India was quite limited, and so there was this space where this engagement could be carried out. Even 100 years ago, we can still see that this engagement was not purely a sort of cerebral thing. It was also partly performative, partly as a method of really planting your political flag, so to speak. And that space was available to them at that point. So I think, while yes, to a certain extent, we may have lost it, part of it is also, it was a product of its times as well.
Can I just add to that?
Please.
Because I do think that we tend to forget that Indians were not ruling their own country at the time. It's amazing to think and discuss and articulate your positions when you're not governing. Now, and the idea of the election cycle hadn't really set in. So people haven't understood that they're catering to specific election cycles. For Nehru, it took the longest time to understand that, every couple of years there has to be like this big vote, and that he has to gear his politics towards that big democratic event where people are going to the polls and, sort of deciding yes or no. So we are talking about a large group of people who are engaged in open debate because they can. They're not governing. And I do think that today people are just as intelligent, and I'm sure both Modi and Rahul Gandhi could have deep intellectual engagements if they wanted to, but there's too much noise. There's an election cycle that is constantly disrupting the way in which they want to move. There's advisors, a ton of advisors, who tells them what is good and what is not. And both Nehru and Iqbal didn't have that. So there was a genuine respect for the other opinion, and there was an open debate that may not be possible today, maybe because of the diktats of democracy.
I don't want to kind of overstate it, because some of these exchanges, particularly Nehru's exchanges with Jinnah, are like dripping with condescension. They have these really sharp kind of one-liners, right? You can like taste the saltiness in the exchange fired from both sides, right? And they're both engaged in this debate about the Hindu-Muslim question. And there are many bones of contention. Among them are the question of separate electorates, reservations, religious guarantees for minority communities, cultural protection, and so on. But when you go through it, as you've laid them out, it's a really frustrating series of exchanges, because it seems like Jinnah and Nehru are like two ships passing in the night, right? Jinnah was hell-bent sort of against laying out his grievances against Nehru's positions, Why, Tripurdaman, why was that the case? Why was it that it sort of, I don't know, it felt like it took them so long to kind of say, okay, here's actually my position, and here's how it's in opposition to yours?
There are multiple reasons, but I think one of them, of course, is that Jinnah thinks of Nehru as a brash upstart, which, in a manner of speaking, he is, because Jinnah's a highly accomplished lawyer. He belongs to a generation of nationalists, that really built the Congress up. He's the contemporary of Nehru Senior, and he is also at that point the president of the Muslim League. So he thinks, he doesn't really consider Nehru as equal. So he doesn't want to be debating this question with this brash upstart at all. And even apart from that, he doesn't think of Nehru as his intellectual equal. So, you sense the sarcasm where he says, why should I explain my position to you? Why don't you read the newspaper? Why don't you, meet some people and make sense of what really is going on? And it's a very emotional position to take, because you can see Jinnah's ego sort of taking over, where he says, who is this guy? Why should I be talking to him?
And by contrast, the exchange between Nehru and Patel is not quite as acerbic, although it is very pointed. And this, of course, is on the issue of India-China. And before we kind of get into the debate, it might be useful to give a little bit of background to our listeners on their relationship, because it has been described in various ways. Some have called it a partnership. Some have said it was a rivalry. Some have said it was a kind of grudging kind of a collaboration. At one point, Nehru writes to Patel and says, and I want to just quote here, "Lately, new developments have taken place which have made me doubt seriously whether this attempt at joint working serves a useful purpose or whether it merely hinders the proper functioning of government." Adeel, how would you characterize the relationship between these two of the tallest leaders of the nationalist movement?
I mean, key to understanding their relationship, as is key to understanding most relationships that Nehru had, is that they're always mediated through Gandhi. So Gandhi is seriously the key figure who also takes away, in a way, the Congress Party from the rightful heir in the 1920s, which is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and moves it towards the radical wing with a language that is deeply drowned in passion and religious symbolism, and something that Muhammad Ali Jinnah was, of course, opposed to. Ironically, he later becomes the president of the Muslim League and sort of goes a similar path. But we have to see that there was a moderate wing of liberals who tried to acquire India's freedoms through constitutional reforms primarily. So the idea was that, just by lobbying and continuing to lobby the colonial state, India will acquire freedom and it will all be settled amongst the group of politicians that was influential in the Congress Party. And Gandhi takes away the Congress and creates a new group of people who are becoming influential that Gandhi handpicks. And one of them is Adeel and one of them is Nehru. And even early on, their relationship doesn't seem as rosy, even though because they're both tied up in the anti-colonial struggle and therefore, fighting the same bigger enemy, but their differences become immediately visible once they're actually in a position to govern, and especially regarding foreign policy, where we have these two big positions that are clashing. Nehru's position, of course, of internationalism and the big desire that he wants to make all other Asian and global South states believe that that they are all in the same boat, and that transformation and economic upheaval and the alleviation of poverty can only come through a collective pushing back against the capitalist forces, of which he sees colonialism as just being one, but then every other international institution, he always suspects that it's a continuation of colonialism. And then the belief of all of the new leaders in those countries, both in Soviet Russia and in communist China, who believe that Nehru is in fact just the latest ploy that colonialism has installed, and he isn't fully on the side of the communist powers. And they believe that because they do see the specific background that is coming from his English education, the time that he spent at Trinity, but also that Nehru fails to see that colonialism through Chinese eyes, for instance, could look Indian too, because most of the soldiers that were fighting for the British East India Company during the Opium Wars and later on, the traders who moved to the international settlement in Shanghai, who moved to Hong Kong, were of Indian origin. So to Chinese eyes, especially to the young students in Shanghai University that formed around Mao, colonialism did not only look white, it also looked Indian. And therefore, they had a deep skepticism against anything that could come from India. And then, of course, Adeel may have been better positioned with his sort of push to national sovereignty and towards, keeping India independent and strong.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. Tripurdaman, we talk a lot in the current era of the personalization of foreign policy and the way in which Prime Minister Modi has often redefined India's relations to the world through his own connections with leaders, whether it was Donald Trump or Shinzo Abe or even Barack Obama for that matter. But was this not actually the same could be said about Nehru, right? I mean, you write at one point that one of the major functions of Indian diplomacy was the projection and protection of Nehru's image as this kind of champion or savior of the third world. So is this not a kind of old recipe in India?
In one way, yes. For Nehru, foreign policy was very highly personalized, and Nehru prized his position as a sort of global statesman, leading Asia and the global South towards a new dawn of socialism. It's something that he prized really greatly. But it was also, while this was the case, it was also a kind of instrumental decision because India really lacked any sort of material capabilities. So it played a role in global affairs far greater than its sort of material capabilities allowed, and that gap was really bridged by this, the presence of Nehru, or Nehru, the champion of the champion of Asia, and that was the only, that was what allowed Indian diplomacy to really punch above its weight, to insert itself into negotiations on Korea, for example, or later on to insert itself into what was going on in the Middle East with the Suez Canal. So with it was something driven perhaps to a certain extent by vanity, but it was also equally a sort of instrumental decision, driven by structural inadequacies.
And maybe I can just add to that. So the criticism of Nehru as an internationalist is also already something that emerges in the 1930s. So if we read the debate with Jinnah and Nehru carefully, then one of the critiques that Jinnah has about Nehru is that he's not interested in India. And he says that in these words. He says, you don't really care about India, you're more interested in the international question. And then Nehru comes back and says the problems are international. So the only way in which we can solve them is solve them collectively. Because if your enemy is capitalism and your solution is socialism, then of course everything transcends nation state boundaries.
It's amazing to read how clear-eyed Patel was. And we're talking going back to 1950. On the nature of the Chinese threat, right? He writes at one point that China, quote, continues to regard us, meaning India, with suspicion, and the whole psychology is one, at least outwardly, of skepticism, perhaps mixed with a little hostility, end quote. And he kind of goes on to prosecute, the case. And meanwhile, you have Nehru, on the other hand, espousing the principles of the sort of, Asian solidarity, Chinese-Indian partnership. Now, we know that Patel obviously shared his views on China with great clarity and urgency towards Nehru. But what about to the outer world? Was he successful at that time in Indian history in provoking a wider debate on foreign policy questions? Tripurdaman, maybe I'll start with you.
No, he wasn't. And you see this in his letters as well, because he keeps making the point saying, I've given Nehru a free hand in foreign policy up to this point until I felt that India's national interest was under serious threat. So there doesn't seem to be that sort of wider debate on foreign policy, even though other members of the cabinet have, obviously weigh in. So contrary to popular belief, foreign policy isn't just a kind of one-man show as is often made out, but there isn't that sort of wider debate because Patel consciously shies away from making it an issue for public consumption. I think primarily, sort of just to kind of add to that, I think primarily one reason is that it's driven by his loyalty to Gandhi and this sort of promise that they've made just before Gandhi dies to really, pull together. And Patel, I think, tends to take that very, very seriously.
I mean, one of you spoke earlier about the role, Adeel, might have been you, that Gandhi plays, and it's almost humorous at times, right? When you read these exchanges, it was like, well, I saw the letter that you showed to Gandhi, and I talked to Gandhi about our correspondence, and he's going to have a word with you, when he's in Bombay next, and he really is kind of sort of looming very large. I want to kind of move to the fourth debate, which is on the kind of freedom of speech. And this documents the tussle between Nehru and Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who was the founder of the Jansangh, which of course is the sort of predecessor political party to the BJP. And what's interesting here, and you note this at the outset of the chapter, is that Nehru and Mukherjee's views run somewhat opposite to what their public images are, right? Nehru is here, the great liberal, supposedly vehemently defending curbs on free speech. The conservative Mukherjee is sort of, kind of doing the opposite. Adeel, tell us a little bit about Mukherjee's position, right? What was his counter to Nehru's decision to amend the Constitution this way? And how widely was it shared among the sort of conservative part of the sort of Hindu right?
Mukherjee is taking a position that may seem odd at first, but it's a classic liberal position. So he's mirroring classic liberalism back to Nehru, who's now in power and clamping down on the Constitution, especially the right of freedom to speech. And Mukherjee is just saying that, well, if these are the principles, then how can you do that? And Nehru is going the other way. And it's something that Tripurdaman has written a great deal about in his book 16 Stormy Days. But what I would like to remark here, maybe before he comes in and explains this into greater depth, is that compared to other post-colonial heroes and leaders, who had the full public opinion behind them, Nehru was still very timid when it came to changes in the Constitution and taking away civil rights. So if we look at other post-colonial leaders, they tossed the Constitution in the bin and declared themselves outright dictators and ran the country like this until they died. So Nehru didn't take that route. So yes, while constitutional purists can well argue that he did not live up to the full promise of republicanism that he had made in the 40s and in the 30s, nonetheless, I would just like to remark that before Tripurdaman takes the question on.
Yeah, Tripurdaman.
Yeah, no, I think Adeel is right. But as you point out, actually, Mukherjee's figure is really interesting. And while he's often remembered as the founder of the Jansangh, Mukherjee was also, at that point in time, the president of the All India Civil Liberties Conference. And he was one of the sort of primary movers of this sort of civil rights movement, civil liberties movement, sorry. And he both chaired the Civil Liberties Conference and later on kind of used the Civil Liberties Conference as a sort of platform to argue against the First Amendment and against any further curtailment of civil liberties. Now, as Adeel said, his position is a sort of classical Whig sort of position, and Nehru's position really belies this, genteel image that has come to dominate public discourse now. But Nehru was very much, and my former supervisor Chris Bailey has written about this in his book. Nehru was a sort of liberal, but of the communitarian kind. So, and he never shied away from expressing that view. He always said that the purpose of the Constitution was to, feed the starving millions and clothe the naked masses. And so, for him, the Constitution was a vehicle, as was everything else that was towards, it was a vehicle for economic upliftment, and everything else, including civil liberties and fundamental rights, was very much a secondary question. And he kind of says this. He says this often during the debate, where he likens these to, ossified slogans of the French Revolution, and those are things in his mind which have been superseded by the bigger question, which is the economic question.
You say the following about the First Amendment, and maybe this is a good way to sort of wrap up the conversation. It's a pretty stark line from the book, quote, "If the Republic's founding moment was transformative, then this transformation was partially cut short and amputated by the First Amendment," end quote. That's a pretty bold and sort of devastating claim. Tripurdaman, let me start with you again. You more than anyone have really studied this. What were the lasting impacts of this amendment? How would you characterize it for somebody who is paying attention in today's India but doesn't know the back history?
I mean, the most important, of course, was the revalidation of sedition, which is a law that we have heard a lot about in the last 5 to 10 years, especially since Narendra Modi took power. And most recently, you have this sort of quite bizarre spectacle where 1,000 sedition cases are being filed against Rahul Gandhi. And I found it quite funny when that happened, because when he revalidated sedition, Nehru wraps up his speech and he says, this is my present. This is our present to the succeeding generations. And when these 1,000 cases were filed, it really sort of brought the metaphor starkly back, in focus. But so the revalidation of sedition, the widening of restrictions on free speech, which allowed not just sedition, but any law which was in the interest of the security of the state, could really be written up to clamp down on the right to free speech. And the other big one was, of course, the legalization of reservations, which is a very particular form of affirmative action for backward classes that you have in India. And the third big one, of course, was the creation of the Ninth Schedule, originally meant only for zamindari abolition laws. And the Ninth Schedule, for those who don't know, is a special schedule in the Indian Constitution in which laws can be in which basically unconstitutional laws can be placed to make them immune to judicial challenge. So there's a famous quip about it, which says that the Indian Constitution is the only one that needs protection against itself. And those were lasting effects. You still, you only have to ask Nehru's great grandson, who's now facing the 1,000 sedition cases, as to what the after effects of the First Amendment are.
Adeel, how do you think about this question, as a historian, given the climate during which Nehru was contemplating this decision, right? I mean, obviously it's taking place in the aftermath of the horrors of partition, a lot of uncertainty about vociferous tendencies in the Indian polity, questions about language, secessionism, and so on and so forth. I mean, these clearly must have been really vital factors, right, that helped to shape his thinking on some of these issues.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. So I think what happens with Nehru after partition is a very, very sobering moment. And the sobering moment that kicks in for Nehru is that he gets a fundamental element of Indian politics wrong. And that fundamental element is the communal question. And he gets it so wrong that the country is split. And that leaves after effects, and that also makes Nehru sort of more open towards the demands from minorities, that makes him more open to the reservations that Tripurdaman just mentioned, and that also makes him more virulent, that a leader could come in that could stoke up those fears. So I'm not saying that Nehru became illiberal in order to prevent illiberalism from spreading, but he moved in a direction in order to preserve what he considered the values of the Indian nation to be. And those values of toleration he sought to preserve, and he was willing to sacrifice everything over it, even the constitutional text. And as was just outlined, I mean, it had tremendously negative effects in India, but it still allowed India to remain a constitutional democracy. So with all the negativity that we just pointed out to, let's have a little bit of optimism, because other countries just around the border just were plagued with military coups. The constitution was nothing more than a scrap of paper, and was abandoned more than once in the period of the last 70 years. So whereas Nehru did put or kicked off a specific path dependency that wasn't healthy for the Indian Republic, there are many other examples that are far worse. And those examples tend to be the norm for post-colonial countries.
Tripurdaman, do you want to have the last word on this?
No, I mean, I think Adeel is right in the sense that given 70 years down the line, no one has repealed the First Amendment or tried to overturn it. It very much is part and parcel of the country's political legacy. So I think maybe he's right. It is these amendments. This could be called. In fact, I recently wrote a newspaper article arguing that these are indigenous elements. This is what makes the Constitution uniquely Indian, and perhaps that's what has allowed the Constitution to survive and for India to remain both united and a liberal democracy, is because the Constitution allows these sort of illiberal experiments or illiberal enclaves, if we might call them that.
It's a really interesting thought. I just end by, I remember reading a column by Pratap Bhanu Mehta several years ago in the Indian Express, and we'll link to that in the show notes. And it was during a time when the government was using sedition and clamped down on dissent in a way that was coming down very hard on the Congress party, and encouraging the Congress leadership to embrace a kind of new freedom charter, right, that would try to repeal, if they were ever to come back to power, some of these illiberal elements. And it's interesting to me that there really are no takers, right, on that side, perhaps because they also find these tools to be rather convenient when in positions of power. But I want to thank both of you for joining us today. The book is called Nehru, The Debates That Defined India. It's a new book by Tripurdaman Singh and Adeel Hussain. It takes us back to consequential debates from history that are very much part of the present day discourse, and a joy to read, and really an education for those of us who haven't read a lot of this primary correspondence and primary documentation. So, gentlemen, thanks to both of you for taking the time, and congrats again on the book.
Thank you so much for having us, Milan.
Thank you, Milan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth, Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff Jayapranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.